This is Lunchtime Agenda.
Hello and welcome to Lunchtime Agenda. I'm Laura Jays, and today the Treasurer is being forced to defend the equity and the fairness of the government's budget once again. This is after figures released under Freedom of Information show low-income households are bearing the brunt of the cuts. The figures you can see here, well, Joe Hockey says these numbers are misleading and don't take into account the entirety of the budget and low-income exemptions.
It fails to take into account pensions, which is not included in that table, which are a substantial payment. It also fails to take into account the massive number of concessional payments, such as discounted pharmaceuticals and a range of other things, discounted transport, discounted childcare that goes to lower income households. So the information as presented is deliberately misleading, and it does not represent the true state of affairs.
But the Shadow Treasurer says the reality is much worse than those figures suggest. He argues the disparity would be much worse in the outer years because the debt levy is only temporary, but the cuts to family tax benefit are not. The numbers also don't take into account the Medicare co-payment and the fuel excise.
This glass-jaw Treasurer saying these figures are wrong. Well, they're not the figures of Fairfax, they're not the figures of the Labor Party, they're the figures of the Australian Treasury. Figures which he was trying to hide. So the Treasurer should just acknowledge the reality that his budget is unfair. He should acknowledge the facts that the Treasury figures show his budget is unfair, and he should admit that he's got this budget fundamentally wrong.
Joining me now is Liberal MP Andrew Laming and Labor MP Kelvin Thomson. Thank you both to you so much for joining me. Now, Andrew Laming, first to you. Let's have a look at these figures. These figures seem to suggest that the budget is unfair. How do you argue against that?
Look, for Australians looking at these figures, they'd say everything was tickety-boo under John Howard. We then had a Labor government that didn't change our tax system much, but they started giving money out before they actually had earned it. So when you're trying to fix a payment problem, Laura, obviously people receiving payments are going to be seeing changes, whereas people who pay into the system and are self-reliant won't be as much. What strikes me, Laura, is that middle and higher income earners are about $500 worse off, and that delta of $344 more for low income earners is less than CPI on their $12,500 payments. So this is a very small difference, which, as Joe Hockey has pointed out, may not even be there if we incorporate all of the other low-income exemptions that are available.
Kelvin Thomson, I'm sure you see this differently.
Well, Laura, this is a fundamentally unfair budget, and the Treasury figures give the game away. They make clear that for low-income families, an average low-income family, they will be $844 a year worse off as a consequence of this budget. And when Andrew says this is a small amount, I remind you of all the song and dance that the Liberal Party has gone on with concerning the carbon price, claiming that it will benefit households to the tune of $550 a year. Now, that claim itself is full of holes, but nevertheless, even taken at face value, it is much less than low-income families will be forced to lose as a consequence of this budget, and these figures themselves don't take into account the impact of the co-payments, the payments which the government is proposing for people who want to visit the doctor.
Yeah, that's right. Andrew Laming, is there an argument here that, in fact, if it was really fair, this budget, well, the debt levy wouldn't be temporary at all, it'd be permanent?
Well, of course, anyone who's going to be $1 worse off will make the argument that it's an unfair budget, Laura, but in reality we're fixing a Labor problem. We didn't wake up this morning deciding we had to change the Australian payment system. We have $25,000 per person of debt. We have $1 billion a month that should be being spent on Australians that aren't, and this is the problem this government is determined to fix. Now, as I've said again, we know that most low-income families are receiving on average over $12,500 a year. Our pension payment system amongst the most generous and well-targeted in the world, and this delta between what everyone chipping in $500 and this extra $300, which probably isn't there when you add in the concessions that are available to low-income earners just shows that every Australian is putting their shoulder to the wheel. It won't be easy. It won't be painless. But what's clear to me here is that everyone is sharing the load.
You still have to convince the crossbench and really the public on this, though. But Kelvin Thomson, to you, we've seen that the Treasurer Joe Hockey has met with one of the crossbenchers today, David Leyonhjelm. And David Leyonhjelm has made one suggestion. This comes to the pension, and he says that any asset test for the pension should include the family home, and the government should be facilitating a reverse mortgage market. What do you think about that?
That is a completely inappropriate suggestion, Laura. I've got many constituents who came to Australia after the war and bought a home in Pascoe Vale or Coburg, and over the years they have seen their homes appreciate in value very greatly, but all they want to do is to go on living in their homes in retirement the same way that they've been able to do in years gone by. It would be grossly unfair to them to include the value of the family home in the assets test, and the government should take no part of it. I point out to you that it's not just one but two boys in the crowd today pointing out that this budget emperor has got no clothes. We had the Liberal Senator Dean Smith talking about the paid parental leave scheme and how that gives the lie to the idea that we've got any kind of budget emergency. And we've also got the Liberal MP George Christensen saying that pensioners should be exempted from the $7 payment to visit the GP.
Yeah, I just want to bring that up with Andrew Laming. Andrew Laming, as a doctor by trade, can you see how there's inequity in this Medicare co-payment? Do you at least see that pensioners should be exempt, or to see a specialist that should be exempt? Is there room to move here for you?
Well, it's not a matter of me moving. Obviously, I'm interested in ideas, proposals, hearing what the AMA has to say, but I'm also mindful
that 2/3 of all the items... Are you open to those ideas? Are you open to that idea of exempting pensioners, though?
I think it's important that all of these are on the table for debate, but my personal view is that the future of our health system is looking after the sick and finding new systems to look after those who need it most. And all of those items under Medicare that involve coordinated care, team-based care and care for the most needy are all actually exempted from the co-payment. So we don't want to be too blinded by this. We're trying to shift away from 5-minute medicine towards appropriate care for people with chronic disease, and that's exactly what can happen here, and the co-payment is not applied to those items, and they're the people we need to be looking after most.
Kelvin Thomson, the government, the opposition, Bill Shorten has always said in the case of this budget that Labor is not going to be obstructionist. It's willing to look at sensible measures, but there's no evidence of that so far, except for perhaps the debt levy. Any areas that you would urge your party to negotiate on and get to a sensible centre?
Well, the measures that we've been talking about here, Laura, are measures which amount to theft from pensioners, from students, from the unemployed, and Labor will not be driving the getaway car. We have a responsibility to look after people who are not well off, and the attacks on students and pensioners and the unemployed, making them wait for 6 months before they're entitled to any payments at all, are fundamentally unfair, and it is not for us to negotiate on these things. The claims of budget crisis are without foundation.
By not negotiating with the government, Kelvin Thomson, you're leaving it in the hands of Clive Palmer and the Palmer United Senators. Would you agree?
Well, it's a matter for the Senate and for all the senators to behave as they think is appropriate on the individual measures that come before them. But I remind you of the comments made by Tony Abbott back in 2007 when he said that the Liberal Party should resist the intellectual bullying inherent in talk of mandates, and said the elected opposition is no less entitled than the elected government to exercise its political judgment and to try to keep its election commitments. Now, we intend to keep our election commitments to pensioners, to students, to the unemployed, and to argue that there should not be cuts to health and education.
Okay, Andrew Laming, just finally on the paid parental leave scheme, we've seen today David Leyonhjelm say it's contradicting your argument. We've seen a number of backbenchers, national MPs behind the scenes threatening to cross the floor. Is it time the government, the Prime Minister, drops this signature policy altogether?
Look, you won't find me disagreeing with wage replacement for women who go and have children. I mean, it's fascinating how workplace entitlement for women is a massive issue, but it ceases to be when it's the coalition government fixing it. I don't hear Labor saying that we need to change all of our sick and annual leave payments back to the minimum wage, but it's okay to enforce that on young working women. Look, forget the 2% that earn over $100,000. 81% of working Australian women are earning more than the minimum wage, and they don't deserve to be discounted when they have a child. They have a mortgage to pay, and we are just coming in line with the rest of the world. It's just Labor that doesn't get it.
Andrew Laming, Kelvin Thomson, we are going to have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining me on Lunchtime Agenda.
Pleasure.
A quick break on the program. We'll be back.